You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Shamansky. It's time to turn the table on Széll. You can usually find him hosting My Life in Books or working on his latest novel, or warming up to climb a nearly 400-foot rock face, amongst many other extreme sporting activities. Red, welcome again to the show.
Hi, Jacob. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. I want to start with pointing out that we have a strange amount of similarities. We're both show hosts on AMI Audio. We're both massive bookworms. We both have a big interest in rock climbing. Maybe interest is somewhat of an understatement in your case. We'll get to that. And we both had vision loss in our early adulthood. I just had to point that out. This is going to be like interviewing a more accomplished version of myself, but I want to get started.
That's very kind of you to say so, but yeah, no, I mean, we do have an inordinate amount in common, don't we?
It's really quite strange. I want to talk about three things, really. One is your books. Two is your rock climbing and how that actually ties into your authoring. And also your show, My Life in Books. Let's start with this, though. Tell me about The Old Man of Hoy. Now, to be clear, I'm not talking about your 2015 book, The Blind Man of Hoy. I'm talking about the 450-foot Scottish rock face. What is it, and what does it mean to you?
Okay, as you say, it's a 450-foot tall finger of sandstone sticking straight up out of the Atlantic off the west coast of Scotland, off the Orkney Islands. Sea stacks, it's a sea stack. Sea stacks for anybody who doesn't know about them are formed when a relatively soft rock type, such as sandstone or limestone, gets eroded by the waves. And first it creates something called a sea arch. And when the top of that arch collapses, you're left with this finger of rock or sea stack at the end of it. And because of Scotland's geology, there's a lot of Acadian sandstone there, beautiful red sandstone, quite hard, quite durable. And this 500 million year old rock has been worn away and created many, many sea stacks. There are three big ones, but the mightiest of them all is the Old Man of Hoy, which is the tallest sea stack in the Northern Hemisphere and the second tallest in the world. Oh. So, of course, I had to climb it.
Well, you say, of course, I had to climb it, but I think there's more there. Like, how did your love of rock climbing begin, and why did you want to climb that specific stack?
My mum and dad would tell you that my climbing began in the cot. Basically, I think my first major traverse was of the cot side to get down to my toy box when I was about 9 months old. And I was always climbing trees and barns and buildings and lampposts as a kid. And I saw a documentary when I was in my very early teens about the world-famous British rock climber Chris Bonington. And I was fairly familiar with him from a TV program for kids called Blue Peter, which, followed quite a lot of the Himalayan expeditions to go and climb Everest and K2. But this documentary showed him climbing this sea stack, the Old Man of Hoy, in the late 1960s. And for me, mountains were a million miles away. I grew up in rural West Sussex amongst green fields and hills. But, a rock face, I was familiar with rock faces and cliffs from seaside holidays. And I just thought, I could do that. I really, really want to do that. And so I found that actually the quickest way to get into rock climbing was to join the Army Cadets at school. And even though that meant that I had to dress up in uniform and march around every Monday and get shouted at by people, it did also mean that we could go off to summer camp in the Welsh mountains every summer, and the army would teach me how to climb. And from the age of 13, 14 onwards, that was it. I was just smitten by rock. And I ended up joining a rock climbing club in my local town, and going down to the crags of southern sandstone in Sussex, and cut my teeth there, really. And by the age of 18, 19, when I headed off to university, that was it. I thought I was going to be a great rock climber.
And how did vision loss change your trajectory?
Well, it's like somebody pushed me off the side of the cliff.
It's like you lost the foothold.
Yeah, exactly. Suddenly the world just disappeared from underneath me. I found out just before my 19th birthday that I had this a condition that I'd never even heard of called retinitis pigmentosa. And the consultant just very bluntly said, well, you better prepare to be blind by the age of 30. And
Wow.
yeah, the world just disappeared from under my feet. And one of my first thoughts was, how can I continue rock climbing if I can't trust my sight? How is anybody else going to trust my judgment? No one else is going to want to climb with me. So after a few shenanigans at university, climbing various buildings and actually falling off the roof of a 6-story museum, I hung up my harness for 20 years and gave up all my dreams of being a great rock climber.
Now, you did end up climbing the Old Man of Hoy in 2013, I believe.
Yeah.
And you wrote a book that was detailed that adventure, and this is where you tie your passion with rock climbing with your passion of authoring. Why did you decide to write a book about your adventure?
Well, two reasons. I'd published a novel the year before I really got into climbing again, and it had done moderately well. It was a crime novel. Maybe we'll talk about it later. But I was really, really struggling with the sequel. I had a good idea for the sequel, but I just couldn't make it snap shut. And I mean, I love detective fiction, but I'm really quite fussy, and it has to be good. It has to snap shut, and it has to have the reader going, "Wow, I didn't see that coming." And I just couldn't work out how to get my solution to the novel to snap shut. And I was just taking it out on the climbing wall. Actually, I was going down to the climbing wall every Thursday with my friend, and just climbing and climbing and climbing, and to cut a long story short, we ended up climbing the Old Man of Hoy, and something happened. And I don't give spoilers to anybody's book, let alone my own, but something happened to make me realize that the story I had been presented through my attempt to become the first blind man to climb the Old Man of Hoy had all the elements of a classic adventure. It had a reluctant protagonist, loyal companions, a call to action, giants to defeat along the way, and it had a false ending and a takeaway, a kind of a moral to the end of it. And I just thought, this is stupid. Here I am battling away trying to write this piece of fiction, and fact has presented me with the perfect story, perfect little epic. So I wrote the book, and has to be said, had a lot less trouble getting a publisher for it than I did for my first novel, and people seem to have really enjoyed it. And yeah, I think it's probably, of the two books I've had published, I think it's the one I'm more proud of. It wasn't the first one; just came out fully formed. I loved writing it, but the second one, yeah, the Blind Man of Hoy does give me. I can read that now and go, yeah, I wouldn't change any of that.
But do you think you would change anything about your first novel, Blind Trust?
Yeah, I think it's a typical first novel. It's a bit flabby, it's a bit overwritten, it's got a little too much florid prose in there. I don't think I'd quite learn the lesson that you need to be quite sparing with your adverbs and adjectives. And to be honest, it probably needed a bit of a good edit from a decent editor. But the publisher I had was small. At least they took the book on for Blind Trust. But, they didn't have the resources to give me the haircut that I
Right.
needed.
Right.
But hey, we all learn. And, I interview authors now, and I think they'd all pretty much say the same. The first novel does make them cringe a little bit sometimes.
I find it interesting that you have multiple passions, but that rock climbing and writing are very different activities. One of them is extremely physically grueling, and the other one is not, unless you consider mild carpal tunnel dangerous. Um, but how did writing come into your radar, come into your life?
I've always wanted to write ever since
Hmm.
I was a little kid, and I was picking up Enid Blyton books, and then actually the massive change for me, the light bulb moment, if you like, was reading Agatha Christie's Sleeping Murder when I was about 12 years old, and it's one of her more psychological novels. It was written in the middle of the Blitz, actually, when Christie clearly thought that she might not live till tomorrow. And so, yeah, it's got a deep psychological twist to it. And as an impressionable 12-year-old, I went, oh my God, the author can actually pull the wool over the reader's eyes and play tricks with them and play with their mind. I so want that. And it was about, funny enough, it was about the same time as seeing Chris Bonington climb the Old Man of Hoy. Clearly, it was a formative time for me. I just went, yeah, my life's not going to be complete without that. And so, yeah, I had some embarrassing goes at writing short stories and embryonic novels that never saw the light of day. But I went off and studied English at university, and I was always writing articles. I became a journalist for a bit. I've always written. Barely a week goes by without me writing something. Most of it doesn't see the light of day, but it makes me happy.
The way you describe writing, you make it sound very manipulative. The way you can pull the
I,
wool over the reader's eyes and how you can lead them in certain directions.
I wouldn't say it's manipulative. It's ludic. It's playing with people's expectations,
Mm.
and it's smoke and mirrors. And I've never been a physically deft person. I could never do magic tricks or anything like that. And I could never, I never learnt to play a musical instrument. But I suppose I use words a bit like a musical instrument, just to change mood and change tone. And I find words fascinating.
Hmm. In 2011, you released your first book, Blind Trust. In 2013, you summited The Old Man of Hoy. Then in 2015, you released The Blind Man of Hoy, the story where you tell your story of the adventure of climbing the Old Man of Hoy. Um, that seems like it must have been, just based on the timeline, a very busy time in your life. How do you reflect back to? How do you reflect back on those years?
Yeah, it was a very busy time. I mean, I think I like being busy. I like having
Mm.
stuff to do. The devil makes work for idle minds in my case, I think. So and both my kids had started at secondary school. I was a house husband for 16 years, looking after the kids, whilst my wife went and earned a decent wage. And I loved looking after the kids, but when they went to secondary school, I just had more time on my hands. I wasn't changing nappies and going off to the playground and, going to kids' music clubs and stuff like that. I had sort of 4 or 5 clear hours at home. And this story of Blind Trust it had been bubbling away in my head pretty much since I got my diagnosis. So, it had had a long gestation period, and it just came out. I wrote it in 6 weeks. I was writing, 2, 3 thousand words a day, and it just, I, it had to come out. And then writing can be a bit of a drug. When it's going really well, you just don't want to lose that ride. And so I just went straight into the second book. But also I need to keep fit, and I still had a bit of sight back then, but I wasn't able to. I'd had to give up most of the sports that I'd really, really enjoyed and kept fit with. And, Pilates and yoga is all very well and good, but it doesn't give you that buzz. And I need,
Mm.
I like to get high at the end of a rope. And when my daughter's 9th birthday came around and she said that she wanted to have it at our local climbing wall, I just saw a safe way of getting back into climbing. And I very shyly went up to one of the instructors there and just said, "Would you teach me to climb again?" And he went, "Well, why wouldn't I?" And I kind of waggled my white cane at him and went, "In case you haven't noticed, mate." And he went, "Well, you're just giving me a different perspective to work from. You'll make me a better instructor." And I don't know what you found at climbing walls and the various crags you might have visited, but actually, climbers are natural problem solvers. And I have never had any adverse reaction to being a blind climber. I'm far more likely to get a good on you. And how on earth did you do that? Wow. Okay. So you can climb it that way, can you? Oh, that's kind of like sometimes I find the more intuitive way up. And so it's about comparing notes with people, I think, climbing. And that's why I love it. It's a community, and it's my community.
What I remember from doing rock climbing is, I think you said it already, that rock climbers are natural problem solvers and you work together on solutions. If you're looking at a wall and you're finding one part particularly difficult, you gather around and say, "Oh, what if you put your heel on that foothold and then move in this way?" And then you work together. It's a really cool sense of community. So I can see why the climbing community would be particularly open to having a blind climber in their gyms and on their rock walls and everything. It totally makes sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski, and I'm talking to Széll about his show, My Life in Books, his books, and his rock climbing. I want to talk about your third passion now, and that's broadcasting. You have a show called My Life in Books on AMI Audio where you talk to authors about their books. And it's a long-form show. We have lengthy interviews, nearly an hour. Now, when you talk to these authors, what are you looking to get out of them? What are you looking to learn?
I want to get something that you're not going to get from the blurb on the back of the book or from their Wikipedia page or actually from any other interview that they've done. Obviously, because I've lost my sight, I have to listen to their books. And I think that actually gives you a different reading experience. And I I hear trends in people's work. Sometimes you can hear the voice between the words. I think that's partly because often you're listening to a narrator interpret the words as they've read them. And so I want the listeners to get to know the author who holds the pen or controls the keyboard. And we do that through the way they story tell. So obviously we'll discuss their latest book and we'll discuss the themes in it and we'll discuss what made them write that story. But that too is a gateway to why are you the kind of author that you are? How does the language you use reflect the thought processes that go into your writing? And I always equate it to inviting an author round to my house to sit and have a pot of tea and a plate of biscuits and just talk about our mutual love of books. And I mean, it's a very simple but very honest way of having a conversation. I'm not there to trip anybody up. I don't. A lot of authors can be quite nervous because they express themselves in writing, and some of them you can tell find interviews quite difficult, and
Mm.
they're worried that they might say something that they might regret. The beauty of My Life in Books is it's a pre-recorded show, so you know actually if the author were to come back afterwards and go, I really regretted saying that, and it's never actually happened, but um, I would actually probably edit it out, and unless I felt
Mm.
it was really, really important. But I I want to make the interview enlightening for everybody, including the author, and that's not by attacking people like you here on the sort of the program, the news programs in the morning. That's not my bag. I've been interviewed a couple of times like that, and
Mm.
to be honest, it doesn't encourage you to go back on that show.
No, not at all. You mentioned that you notice trends. I'm
Mm.
curious if you notice trends in the places that authors find their inspiration. You described to us earlier how you found your inspiration for your two books, The Blind Man of Hoy and Blind Trust. What are some typical places where authors find inspiration?
History. I think virtually maybe two-thirds of the authors I interview actually have a keen interest in history. And that's not to say they'll be writing historical fiction, but I think authors like compare and contrast. So they might have read an article about something and that happened 100 years ago, and it will spark an idea for a story that they can write in contemporary time, or they can do a compare and contrast. Time slip novels are actually quite popular at the moment. The pandemic is an absolute classic with this. So
Yeah.
obviously a lot of people were sitting home twiddling their thumbs, but the number of books that feature the Spanish flu pandemic of 1919 that are being published now shows just how most authors' minds work. It's like, wow, okay, there's nothing new under the sun. What can we learn from history, and how can I make that into an interesting story now?
So, in other words, just what they see around them. Like, I think authors are very observant people, and I think people
Yeah,
who are just generally intelligent are very observant. You have a really
yeah.
interesting relationship with authors. Seeing as you talk to them all the time. You're one
Mm.
yourself, so you understand them. In nowadays, when it comes to especially big name authors, there's lots of stories of authors with controversial views and people struggling to separate the art from the artist. Where if the author said something
Mm.
controversial, then you can't get into their books. With your perspective and your relationship with authors, can you separate the art from the artist?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, very much so. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think there are areas which that can be a little bit more muddy. And to be honest, I don't tend to stray into those areas. But yeah, I think, people are storytellers. You don't have to enact your fantasies and your ideas physically. You can put them down on the page. You can um, you can explore them that way. The world is a pretty unpleasant place, and people have been vile to each other since God fell off the bus. But it's but part of the way we separate ourselves and make sense of that vileness, the horrible things that happen in the world, is to process them as stories. And, you know, Bret Easton Ellis, for instance, might have developed a little bit of an unhealthy interest in psychopaths and sociopaths by writing and researching American Psycho. But the last time I checked, he wasn't going out there and enacting the horrible things that he he wrote about. You know, and in a book like we need to talk about Kevin, it has to be a shocking book. It has to have a sort of Columbine type aspect to it, because that's the way it was written. That was the kind of thing it was responding to. Human beings need to try to process the awful things that happen around them. Otherwise, we would go stark staring mad. And art is the place to do that. And so I don't read polemic type hate books, and there are unfortunately people out there publishing and self-publishing those. I tend to stick to the bigger, better known and more worthy publishers who at least I feel have filtered some of the awful stuff out. I have been approached by authors who clearly have a message that they want to peddle, and sometimes I take them up, and sometimes I just go, no, not for me. That is the beauty of having the editorial control of who comes onto the show. But yeah, no, I think, you know, even people writing about unpleasant stuff, you know, they're doing it with the best intentions.
Red, that was so well said. I want to thank you so much. We'll have you on the show again for sure. That was Red Széll. He's the host of My Life in Books on AMI Audio. That's all the time we have for this edition of AMI Audiobook Review. I'm Jacob Szymanski. Thanks for listening.